Welcome to Directionally Correct, a people analytics podcast with Cole and Scott. Today's guest, Sonali Kumar, people analyst and podcast host. Hey, Directionally Correct fans. If you're looking to stay connected to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, watch our videos on YouTube, or listen to the podcast on your app of choice. This podcast is dedicated to you to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics. We are a listener-supported podcast, so please consider becoming a patron. If you'd like to support the podcast by becoming a patron, you can find a link to sign up in the show notes or at patron.podbean.com/directionallycorrect. Thanks for being a listener. All opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization.
Hi, Cole. How are you today?
Hey, Sonali. So from how I know you started out not being in people analytics, but you were very well known in the data
Mm.
sphere. Like I would call you a data evangelist, even perhaps. And then you made your entrance into people analytics. What before we get into that, I'd love to talk about like how did you get into the data field? What is that? What were you doing back then, or what are you
Mhm.
still doing? Tell us a little bit more
Yeah.
about that.
As you mentioned, I didn't necessarily start out in people analytics, also because I didn't know this field existed. I was, well, even going back, I studied criminal justice, so I kind of thought that I was going to go work for the FBI. I soon
Hmm.
realized, close to graduation, that that's not the path for me. I was like many 20-year-old kids who graduate college, realized I don't know what to do with my life anymore. So I went through those crises and all I focused on was just networking and doing a lot of soul searching to see, what's my personality fit, what skills do I have and where would they apply. Um I actually wanted to go into HR. I knew that. That's because I wanted to find a field that was people oriented. I
Why?
wanted, yes. I wanted to go into a field that was people oriented, strategic, business oriented. So, like a combination of all of those things. And HR was one domain that kept coming up. So, I decided to do a lot of networking chats, just hitting up people on LinkedIn and finding anything I could through Google searches on what HR even is. So, I fast forward like a couple years down the road, landed a role within HR, and it happened to be for a HR analytics team. And that was my first introduction to what HR analytics is, and the data can exist in the HR space as well. I think I did a lot of reflection a year into that role. I made the intentional decision that this is the field that I want to grow into. Again, didn't know people analytics, even now that field existed on its own. I started creating content on LinkedIn just around the data space. I did research on like how to grow in the data space, and found technical skills that you need, non-technical skills. So decided to keep learning and sharing my journey on LinkedIn and many reasons why I did that. And fast forward a couple years in that role, I was hired into my current role, which is mostly focused on talent acquisition analytics. Um, yeah, that's how I ended up here.
Well, do you like
Yes.
it?
um,
No, no buyer's remorse?
we'll see. I think I've started looking at my career in a very different way. Initially, when I went to college, it was more of like I was under the assumption that you go to college, you get good grades, you get all A's, you graduate, and then you find a career that you're happy with and you stay in for the rest of your life. And then you get married and you have kids and you live happily ever after. All that's a lie.
Sounds like a fairy
All
tale,
that's
doesn't
a
it?
lie. And I did not know it was going to be a lie.
Well, where are you? What stage of the fairy tale are
Oh,
you at right now?
I think up until I graduated college afterwards, nothing matched what I had in my mind or how it works out on TV or what I guess my parents told me. I don't blame them, but
Well, this is actually one of the main reasons why I wanted to bring you
mhm.
on today is I wanted to know because I hear about this stuff anecdotally and hearing from it from you will be anecdotal, but it's still you know more about it than I do at this point. And it's what is it like being early career in people analytics in
Oh.
2025? You know, what skills do you need? You know, what's going to set
Mhm.
you apart? How do you network? I know you're very strategic
Yeah.
about these things, Sonali. So can you share a little bit of
Yeah.
that?
I would say one of the things that I'm realizing is the skills that are gonna be required to grow in not just people analytics, but any field. they're going to change, especially as AI is coming up. When I made the decision to grow in the field, I remember one skill set that kept coming up was not, I knew Excel back then. I was learning Power Query, I believe. And then SQL kept coming up. I'm like, I have no idea what that is, but let's go figure out what it is and let's go learn it. So I remember when I was learning it, like started sharing that on LinkedIn as well, because I wanted to build credibility for myself. Just because I don't have a technical degree, I didn't want someone to question whether or not I knew something because I was teaching myself. So that's one aspect of it. And then again, going back to the skills, what you need, I think before when I started back in 2021 or 2020, a lot of emphasis fell on the technical skills. As AI has entered the picture, a lot of emphasis now are shifting into the non-technical skills that we consider quote unquote soft skills, learning how to communicate, learning how to ask the right questions, learning how to build those relationships with your stakeholder, and learning how to say no. I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned in my career, learning how to say no to certain requests that might not be adding value and might just be taking away time that you could spend on impactful things. I think I answered some of that question.
Yeah. No, no, it's fine because it was kind of a broad question. I love what you said about, it's going to require
Mm,
change. One of my favorite quotes I have written on my whiteboard is, if we're going to stay the same, we're going to have to
mm,
change. And I think that it's kind of a counterintuitive quote, but it's basically like the world is always changing. If we want to continue to have our place in it where it is right now, we have to change along with it.
definitely.
But I love what you were saying about, that like AI is entering the picture, and the skills that are required are changing. How did you actually see that
Mhm.
happen? Like, did it like come up in like job postings, or did like your manager say, you better start using AI for everything, or like how did it actually happen? Like, where did you come to this conclusion from?
I think a lot of it is as I wanted to expose myself to new technical skills. Again, all of it's self-taught, so it's mostly Googling, finding new courses that I could take to be able to teach myself. I remember instead of just searching on Google, I'm going to AI to be able to figure out how to do something that I'm used to doing in Excel, how to do that in Tableau, like putting in the formula like, oh, I'm trying to filter by XYZ. How would you translate this into a technical format in Tableau? Learning how to do that, I think that one thing made me realize it's like, oh, we need to kind of shift away from the non-technical, shift away from just the technical focus. And another thing, in personally, what I notice is a lot of people just on LinkedIn, just conversations that I've come across and talking to people, biggest pain point is we have dashboards, but no one uses it. Okay, well, are you communicating how to use it? Do people, the dashboards you're creating, are they answering the question that the business wants to answer as well? So I think a lot of those things come up, and it all goes back to learning how to have those conversations and learning how to communicate.
Well, I'm sincerely, you triggered me
My
a little
bad.
bit, into like one of my common tropes, which is, I'm curious
Mhm,
in your mind, because again, you're new to the space. You come from the
mhm.
data space. You talked about learning Power Query, learning Excel, learning SQL, learning Tableau. All of those are very much in the dashboardy space or dashboard adjacent space. Is in your mind people analytics just
I really
dashboarding?
hope not. In my mind, that's not the case either. I don't know how to make this statement not sound very harsh. I think we're stuck. I think we're
Make it
stuck in
harsh.
that phase. I think a lot of companies, a lot of, and I don't know if it just applies to people analytics. I think we're just stuck in the phase of taking orders and fulfilling orders. It's less impactful because there's this constant fear that we need to produce value. In order to produce value, you produce whatever the stakeholders ask you to do instead of, because I feel like we're still fighting to be on the table or have a seat on the table. And when you're in the fight or flight, you don't take as many risks. Whereas other data professions or other data domains don't necessarily need to fight to be on the table.
Well, do you think we're in fight or flight? And if so, why? Because again, like like your perspectives
Hmm.
on the world are completely shaped by the
Hmm.
experiences you have. And I suspect our experiences are quite different at different points in our career. So like what are the things you're experiencing? Because like there's so many people I hear, and I'm sure you do too, probably even more than I do. There's so many people out here I hear from that are like junior career, and they're like, how do I break into this? How do I be successful? What do people care about? What problems are they trying to solve? And like basically just like how do I be successful? And I think you even mentioned I think you're building like a resource guide related to
Yeah.
this, right?
I think, well, tying into the resource guide, it's a lot of it's related to the resources that I use to be able to pivot. And there's not, and I'm trying to incorporate more of this, there's not enough emphasis on building those relationships and just networking in the field. Because I think I learned more by talking to people who are already in the people analytics space than just Googling like technical skills. There was, when I first got into HR, I remember the first term that I heard was called a turnover. And I did not know what that meant. And it was in a broad meeting, so I couldn't necessarily just raise my hand of like, "Oh, what does turnover mean?" And I remember just taking down notes on like terminologies that I didn't understand and doing research on what exactly it is, how do you calculate it, and is it different depending on what company you work for? So it's I feel like I just went on a tangent, so I kind of forgot your question, but a lot of those things really stuck with
Yeah.
me is learning how to ask questions and learning how to do your own research. That's really beneficial no matter at what stage you are in your career.
Yeah. Well, I want to call it out here, and I think we'll put
Mhm.
it in the show notes. But you have created a resource guide for people who are new to the space and want to share
Yeah.
it with them as a part of this. But like, how do you actually learn a skill? Like, this is the thing I still
Yeah.
wonder about is like, do people in people analytics have skills? If so, what are they? And if they did not have presumably had them at one point, how did they
Mm.
acquire those skills? Like and you so you mentioned networking, you've mentioned, like you've used a lot of resources before, but like how do you actually acquire a skill?
Are we talking about technical or non-technical skills?
Well, you mentioned earlier the technical stuff was where you
Mhm.
used to focus, and now you're focusing more on, some of the people call them the
Yeah.
softer skills, but you might have called them like the business
Yeah.
impact skills, right? Um, like so maybe take both. Like how do you acquire a technical skill and how do you acquire like a business
I
impact
think the
skill?
technical one is actually easier to answer. For me, it was all about, well, one, narrowing down what you need to learn. And the only way to do that is actually knowing which direction you want to head into. So I did a lot of research on roles so just looking at like job descriptions on LinkedIn or other platforms. So finding those job descriptions, identifying which skills kept coming up. So SQL was one that kept coming up in every single job description I read. So that's how I narrow down and prioritize which skill to learn first, and then finding resources that were actually going to teach you those skills and not just go over like the high level overview. Because I did that, lost my brain while trying to learn something because it was so scattered, and then signed up for courses that would actually teach you, but not in order to retain that knowledge, actually doing practice questions, like finding data sets that are out there, putting it into the SQL server, and then practicing those questions, those business impact questions. So I would say that's one skill, or that's one strategy to learn the technical skill. Non technical skill, I feel like they're kind of harder to teach. They kind of come to you through practice. And one thing is learning how to listen to people. I feel like that's a very underrated skill and underutilized skill is learning how to acknowledge what the other person's saying, whether or not you agree with it, and making the other person feel heard. I genuinely don't know how to teach that. I can just teach nonverbal cues that you can do, but I don't actually know how you would teach that. And critical thinking.
Yeah, so it's like active listening skills
Mhm.
really. And then, you said it just
Yeah.
requires repetitions. A lot of it's just getting the reps. And so that's really important. Selfishly, I'm really glad to
Yeah.
have you on because now in the future when people reach out to me and they're like,
Yeah.
"So I'm new to people analytics, what should I do?" I'm just going to send them a link
That's
to this
perfect.
episode because like I don't have good answers for them most of the time. And so this is really great, but I want to ask you, I don't know if this is
Mm.
a hard question or not, but you're learning
Mhm.
on the go, right? You're doing this, you're building your career, but you also have your own podcast, right? And you're sharing your knowledge with the world. And I know you even used to work for a data company and shared knowledge with the world through that as well. What's it is it like does it feel like super vulnerable to be learning it and sharing it at the same time or is it empowering? Like
Mm.
what is that experience
I
like?
think it's all of it. Um, I know you and I also hosted or recorded an episode together as well. So thank you for that. Many times actually. Um, but one of the things I do suffer with, and I think it's helped me overcome it a little bit, is building my credibility in public. I feel like that was really important for me, especially when I'm coming from a field that's not related to the career that I want to go into. I wanted to utilize platforms like social media platform, in this case LinkedIn or YouTube, to be able to build my credibility. So when I'm talking about things or in my career, I have something to back it up. That's one thing. So it's mostly like selfish reasons. But as I'm building these things in public, it's extremely scary to the point every time I'm hitting record, I feel like it's like an overwhelming feeling of imposter, but then you do it and then you realize, oh, it's not that bad. That was actually fun. So it's realizing what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy and just tapping into that.
Was a part of this, you kind of
Mhm.
touched on it, but is a part of it building your personal brand? Like, is that like a thing? I hear about
Yeah.
that all the time. I'm actually on a session at PsyOp coming up
Really?
about that. And I'm like, I don't know if I've actually thought about
Oh.
this like strategically, but like, was this strategic? Was it
Mm.
emergent? Is it something that you've been really careful about? Like, what are your thoughts on building a personal brand?
I feel like we live in, and I hate to say this because in order to land a role, you should not be having to build a personal brand just to be able to work at a place or just to be able to pivot into a career. But I think as times change, as we talked about adapting as times change, changing as things change, one of the biggest things that keep coming up is the personal brand. When I started, I didn't know what personal brand was. I probably still don't know if I'm doing it right. I'm just trying things and see if they work. If they do, then great. Then you keep going. So it's a lot of it's like trial and error. But when I started, again, it was more about building credibility and just building my confidence in the space that I'm going into, that I'm super new to. And then slowly shifted into sharing my insights with individuals who also want to pivot into the field. I had this big misconception that in order to hold a technical role, you need to have a technical degree. And I'm so glad that misperception was broken because that's exactly why I'm able to grow into this field. And I think that's one thing, if anyone who's listening, if I could share one message, it would be like, you can pivot at any point you want. As long as you're willing to put the effort and work into learning new things, you'll be just fine. You don't need to box yourself into one career just because you studied it or one career just because that was the first role that you end up taking. You have a big life, so go live it in whatever field you want and feel free to change. Because I have a feeling I might change like 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. I might be doing something completely different.
Well, like one of the things that we talked about in
Mhm.
prepping for this was like conferences and what role do they play? Do they play a role in building your
Mm.
personal brand? Do you acquire skills at conferences? Do you network at conference? Like, are conferences just a nice to have? Like,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
My initial thoughts on conferences, they are expensive. So if you're going to go attend it, especially if you're paying out of pocket, know how to get the best ROI from it. And if you need to get pointers, I'm gonna plug you in this case, Cole. Go watch Cole's and Richard's webinar that you guys recently did on conferences, is how to make the best of conferences. Um, I wouldn't think it's maybe you should link that in the show note. I wouldn't think it's a waste of time. I
Yeah.
just think knowing which one to attend is really crucial. Talk to people who have attended those conferences in the past and see if that's exactly what you want. For me, I've attended a few last year. I personally don't think I got the best ROI because I didn't have a very good approach. For me, I thought to get the best out of the conferences was attending every single session to the point where your brain hurts. And that was not effective because I could not pay attention after a while. And you mentioned this during, or Richard mentioned this during your webinar. It was those hallway conversation. And I have a feeling next time you attend a conference, everyone's just going to be sitting in the hallway and just talking to each other instead of attending one of those sessions.
I doubt it. I don't think that many people listen, but and you go to
Mhm,
learn. And I'll also say just as a life hack because it doesn't sound like your employer has paid
mhm.
for them, but a lot of times employers will pay for people to go to
That's true.
conferences. So try to. It doesn't
Oh
hurt to
yeah,
ask at a minimum.
many times. Keep asking.
Yeah.
How about you? What's your take
Well,
on it?
like
I don't know if you wanted to add
my
something to the
my take.
conferences.
No, I'm always going to them. I'm leading one later
Mhm.
this year, and I go to SIOP every year for the most part. And yeah, it's just I have so many thoughts on it, but yeah, just go watch that webinar with Richard,
Yeah,
and
return call.
they can get my thoughts on it. I don't want to
Mhm,
belabor the point. Um, we've done a ton of
mhm.
stuff together, right? So you hinted at it earlier. I think you've had two different podcasts, and I've been on both
Yeah.
of them as a guest. I think we've done two webinars together at previous employers
Mhm.
as well, and we've done a variety of other things outside of work. Like we even met up, I think, a
Yeah.
few times now. But what, like, tell me, like establishing
Mhm.
relationships and building versus networking. What are those the same thing? Are they
Yeah.
different? And how is that, like, shaped your trajectory in the field?
I come from a background where I'm the first person in my family to attend college and graduate and be in the corporate America. I did not know the word networking even existed. Again, after college, I learned so many things that I should have learned when I was in college. So, but maybe I wouldn't have been here. Um, but one of the biggest things when I graduated was, oh, you need to go talk to people. You don't need to just talk to people that you work with. You need to learn what's out there because the world is such a big place. And I initially, when I started, I thought networking was about DMing random people on LinkedIn and telling them, "Do you want to be my mentor?" And just a heads up, that did not work.
I don't know why I find that so funny. I guess it's because I get those DMs, and it's like, come on,
I
guys.
promise Cole was not one of those people where I send the DM. I learned by the time I met Cole. This was a while ago when I was doing that, only to realize, well, that's not really effective. And then I started just seeing networking as having conversations with people and then approaching it with just genuine curiosity. What do you do? Why do you do it? And how does it help? How does it align with what your personal vision is for yourself? And when you die, what do you want to be remembered by? How does that align with what you do? I started approaching networking that way and I realized that that's when I had the best experience even meeting people because one, it took away the pressure that I put on myself that I need to show up to a call and perform, and that's not a good way of approaching networking, kind of seeing it as a building of a relationship. And I think when you and I met, I am so grateful that I had learned those lessons. So when you and I first chatted, we were able to connect and actually build a good relationship over time as well. And it's been 3 years, 4 years? It's been a
Something
while,
like that. Yeah,
something
it's been
like
a while
that.
now.
Yeah. And I think networking and then being able to build mentorship relationship has been super important in my journey because there are times, especially if you're early in your career, there's times where you're just like, am I even on the right path? Am I doing this right? What am I missing? What else do I got to go learn? And sometimes you don't have the answers. And when you have someone in your corner, in this case, like you and I, Cole, me being able to ask you those questions, I think were so helpful. And you showing me certain things in people analytics that I wouldn't have learned unless I went through them like 10 years from now. It's like having access to knowledge that I would have had to wait for 10 years to be able to attain. I think that's really beneficial.
So I think about, like, and you have to put up with all my bullshit, but
I think that's
that's sort of
helpful.
my
See, that's a part
yeah.
of building the relationship. Mine
Yeah,
too.
exactly. But I want to come back to something you say. So,
Mhm.
child immigrants, first one that went to college in the U.S.
Yeah.
You actually told
Or,
me in preparing for this, you speak three different languages,
yeah.
and when you learned English, I want you to tell us what those are and why
Yeah.
you know them. But also that when you learned English, you didn't even know the country, the United States, existed.
I did
So I don't know.
not.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I was in 8th grade. I was relatively young. I think I was just starting out in my teen years, which when my parents decided to pack everything and just move to the US. I did not know the US existed because I grew up very sheltered. I probably watched movies where they hinted or showed US, but I never really desired to go anywhere. And I think all I knew was the town that I lived in, and that's the only place that existed in the world. I know we didn't talk about this, but I didn't know what the internet was until I moved to the US. So I was in 8th grade when I first heard about the internet,
That's wild. Well,
right?
that I mean, yeah, that is kind of. I can't even imagine what that's like. Do you remember? Like, what was
Yeah.
that like?
So in 8th grade, I guess that's the first time, and I don't know how it is now, back then when I was a kid. Now it's probably the first time I was introduced to the concept of computers, like what they are, not even laptops, not phones, because you're not allowed to have phones in school. But 8th grade was the first time I saw a computer. And I remember going into, it's called a computer lab. So you don't have them in, it's like a specific sacred place that you go to. And I probably had exposure for like a month or so until, again, we moved here. And I took a course because everyone's obligated to take that course. It was like technology course. I remember the teacher asked us to do research on, I believe, just sea animals, fish and stuff. And I learned about Google. I put in like, about sea animals or like fishes. And I was doing research and I remember getting so excited. I'm like, I can find so much on the internet. Wow, this is so fascinating. And I remember going up to the teacher telling her that, oh, I found this, I found this. And she looks at me like, as if I was a kid in the candy shop who just learned about so many different candies at the same time. So yeah, that's what that experience was like.
And that's the wildest thing about like skill acquisition and education is you can go from not having heard about something until the 8th grade to being a professional that all you do is use computers in your day
Right.
job, right? In
Yeah.
a relatively short amount of time. It's really wild.
Yeah. I think it's been less than about 15 years, I would say. Yeah. I learned about the internet 15 years ago. Probably more than that, but
It's so crazy. Oh,
it
well, what are the three languages that you spoke
I am.
and where were you living at the time?
So I was live when I moved here, you're saying, or like
Yeah.
back home? I know Hindi, Punjabi, and English, obviously. And then I can also speak Urdu, but it's the same thing as Hindi. It's unless you write it, then I can't read it anymore. So
Oh,
those are
weird.
the three.
Okay.
I know, it's fascinating. So those are three ones I know. And English, I was introduced to English when I was, again, in India, but it was more about like memorizing things. So you don't necessarily understand what you're reading. You don't know how to structure your sentences. So I think it took me 2 years to be able to have conversation in English. And that too was not a good way of communicating. So I learned the hard way on how to have effective conversations in a very new language to me. And I was living in Punjab, which is the state where I'm from, which is why I would say I know Punjabi because it's a state language. And then Hindi, it's unofficial country's language is Hindi. And that's where Bollywood comes into.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. I was trying
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
key something up for later on that. But where do you see so again, kind of going I like the theme of this for me is like, you're in people analytics, it's
Mhm.
2025, you're looking into the future now. Where do you want that to take you in your career?
I think I've hinted on this earlier. I stopped looking at my career as a title and as a linear progression a while ago. And I'm so glad that I did that because it allows me to expand my horizon and learn the skills that I'm curious about or things that excite me versus saying, I need to get this title. I don't care what I need to learn. I don't care what it's going to bring. I've started to see my career as, and I did this before too, what do I want to do? What kind of impact do I want to have? I don't know if I have clear answers on like what I'm going to do or what kind of impact I want to have, but I just know that I want to be in a field where I know I'm making a positive impact on people's life and improving it and ultimately, maybe it helps the business grow and make my money. So I'm
Well,
seeing my
sorry.
career as an acquisitions of different skills.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Well, do those skills translate into jobs? Like what's it
I
like
hope
finding a
so.
job right now? Is it
Oh
murderer's
boy.
row? Like what is it really like?
So I've had conversations with many people who are like beginners or people who are mid-level career professionals, like trying to find a job in 2024 and 2025. And I think we've all seen so many horror stories, especially on LinkedIn. It's you're going through so many processes of interviews. So all the way up until 7+ interviews, all of that, and then you don't hear back. And I think that's where majority of the frustration comes in from people who are trying to break in. And these are not individuals who are just starting out in their career. And I think I listened to one of the podcasts that you did recently. It was, I say recently, but last year. One of the things you mentioned was related to people analytics. You said, and I might be misquoting you, but I'm going to try. Five, 5, 10 years ago, you knowing Excel was just enough to break into this field. But now that's not good enough anymore. And I would say the same thing when I broke into the data space or even people analytics, knowing the bare minimum or even having the fundamental knowledges in technical or non-technical skills was enough. I genuinely don't think that's enough anymore. And not to sound not hopeful, but that's exactly what I've seen or read from other people's experiences.
Well, what is enough? And
Ooh.
and how dare you quote me to me?
I think it's pretty accurate statement. That's why I'm quoting it. Well, you know what? I'm actually going to bring that back to you because I'm not a hiring manager. I don't know what's enough, quite frankly. You tell
Well,
me what's enough because I know you've hired
before I
people.
answer that, I'll ask you kind of one follow-up related to it, which
Hmm.
is some of it AI or is it other things? Like, and
Mm.
is it like people not having AI skills or they think it because AI is making it harder to hire people, or is it that AI is like making employers second guess whether
Mm.
to hire someone at all? Like, does it play a role at all in that equation?
Think so. I think especially the last component that you mentioned, and I know a lot of companies who have said it, or I've read like brief reports on it saying we're going to lay off X amount of people, but it's going to get replaced by AI agents. Is that a good move? Is that a very risky move, a shady move maybe? But
Oh, I
I
think
think,
it's those companies in particular, I think is like they were intending to do a layoff anyway, and they're trying to
mm,
sound like that they're like to brand it as they're like super,
innovative.
innovative and we're laying off people because of this AI when really
Mm,
they were just laying off people and they
mm.
just didn't want to have all the negative publicity around a layoff. But that's my cynical take on it.
That's fair. I mean, I don't think it helped. I think it still resulted in negative outlook on those companies, but I don't think AI is going to take over our positions anytime soon. It's gotten better compared to when it first came out. I guess I like to be hopeful and think that it's not going to replace us anytime soon. But if you learn how to leverage it, it is going to make your job much easier. But I don't know if
Yeah.
that's the skill that I don't know if, like, if I go into an interview now, I don't think AI is one thing that people have asked me because I think a lot of companies are still hesitant to fully launch it or incorporate it into their businesses.
That the answer that I was wanting to hear is
Mhm.
like what are people actually asking about. So
Yeah.
I'll answer your question from earlier is like what are the hesitance or and I think it's just what businesses are going through. And you
Mm.
mentioned, layoffs, we've talked about AI. It's that every open position is being heavily scrutinized or frankly even a lot of times like why do you people go through 7 rounds of interviews and then not hear back? Well, sometimes it's just because you have a shitty candidate process, but sometimes it's because a position got frozen right in the middle of it and you're not able to hire anymore. And then
Yeah.
you're like, well, what do I do? And so there's a lot of different things going on all at the same time. And it's kind of difficult to make heads or tails. But in some of the stuff I've written in the past, what we've talked about, and frankly, like almost the entire book that I've written that's coming out in July is dedicated to, what businesses care a lot about right now. And so like why does a business care about when they're making a layoff that it gets spun as they're being innovative? Is if you start to look at the world through anything you see a business communicate from a publicly traded company,
Mhm.
assume that it is meant to make their stock price go up, right? That
Yeah.
that is kind of the Straussian take on it. It's like it, and so they don't want to announce a layoff unless they think it'll make their stock price go up.
Mm.
And in addition to that, if they think it'll make their stock price go up even more, if they're seen as more innovative with AI, they're gonna do a 2 scoops instead of 1 scoop, right? And so try to
Interesting.
and so I look at it from that sense, but
Mm.
businesses are really, really struggling right now. And I would say I'm
Mhm.
not a hiring manager at the moment. So this is
Yeah.
not speaking about my current role. So please don't reach out to me with your resume, even though it happens anyway. It's really annoying. That when I was a hiring manager, just a lot more scrutiny than there has been in the past. And the only way to get out of that scrutiny is to prove that your positions are adding incremental value above your current team.
Mm.
Right. And so I would say if I'm a candidate interviewing right now, I don't want to just demonstrate that I have skills. I don't want to just demonstrate that I have a personal brand. I don't want to just demonstrate that I can communicate. I want to show that my being at your organization will make the company make more money or not lose more money or make them more efficient, which will help them make more money or make them more innovative, which will help them make more money. Right. And I know like to a lot of people analytics folks for whatever reason, and I don't understand it is that's like an offensive statement,
Mhm.
but it's just the truth.
Yeah.
And so if we focus on that right now, it's a lot easier to find a job if you know that when you hire that person, they will help your team and your organization and HR be seen in a better light and help the company make more money.
It kind of makes me think of one question. When you say, "Oh, I don't know why that statement is offensive," I have a question slash a theory. Is it because people analytics as an organization, at least for me, I try to think of it like, what kind of problems do I want to solve? It's more about like, oh, employee experiences and hence helping company make more money if employee experience is good, hoping that it's going to result in more ROI. Is it the thinking that those two things cannot coexist? Like you can't just think about employees, or if you
I
do,
think
it
people
means you'll
know
make
it
more
can
money.
coexist because at least every behavioral scientist under their sun will
Hmm.
quote like engaged employees are more productive and cite all these research examples like diverse companies are more innovative. And so they know that it has to fundamentally tie to business effectiveness. And I find like the conversations about like what is people analytics to be pedantic. But if you really look at it at simplest form, it's two words, it's people and it's analytics. Some people love the fact that it has people in the title more than it has analytics in the title. And other people like that it has analytics in the title more than it has people in the title. They know the two things are mutually exclusive because they're both in the title. It's just
Right.
some people prefer one over the other, is the way I look at it. I don't even know if that's true, but it's just if there are a person who comes in and it's like, I'm a humanist, I want to do humanist based work, and therefore people analytics is the job for me because I care about the people in the title. It's like you got to
Yeah,
have both. And I think you can ultimately do excellent work for a business and it be people oriented.
I agree. Nothing to add there. I think you said it better.
Yeah. Well, let's do you want to join me in Cole's Corner?
Let's do it.
Welcome to Cole's Corner. So, the first section I've got some rapid fire questions. I kept trying to get you back to some of this stuff because one of the questions wouldn't make any sense if I didn't get you to talk about some of your background.
Oh,
So, the
love it.
first question I have for you is which is better, Bollywood or Punjabi wood? And you
Punjabi
may
would.
have to explain what some of those are too, but
Okay.
please, yeah, tell me what your answer is.
Watch me explain it and not be accurate, like the actual definition. I'm pretty sure people listening, they know what Hollywood is. It's mostly movies that are made in Hollywood. Bollywood is the major film industry in India, which resides in, it's not a place called Bollywood, but it's most of the production is done in Mumbai. And then Punjabi wood, I don't know if that's the actual name, but it's basically Punjabi movies. So if I had to
Which
pick
are a
one,
thing.
it's a thing, and I love them so much. So I guess that's my answer. It depends. If I want to remember my childhood, then it's always Bollywood. If I want to just laugh my ass off, excuse my language, then it's going to be Punjabi movies. I do not really watch Hollywood movies at all, very
Well, it's because
rarely.
they all suck nowadays, but that's another story for another day. But why Punjabi wood? Because in my experience, I've watched a few of them.
Oh, you
Um,
have?
well, in my differentiation between a Bollywood movie
Uh,
and a Punjabi wood movie is, in there's already a lot of dancing in Bollywood movies, but
mhm.
there's more dancing in Punjabi wood movies,
Are there?
and it's like more
Mm.
songs are more upbeat. And I don't know, is that like what if you had to sell, Punjabi movies?
Mhm.
How would you sell them?
If you want to laugh at nonsense that does not make sense, please do so. And again, I'm saying this because those are the Punjabi movies
Yeah,
that
they're
I
kind of
watch is
slapsticky.
filled with
I don't.
comedy. Huh?
Yeah, they're kind of slapsticky, like Three Stooges kind of thing
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would think so. That's why I enjoy them more, and honestly, I don't wanna try to sell it. If you wanna watch it, enjoy it, please go. If you don't like it, I enjoy it, so Imma watch it.
All right. Next rapid fire question: what's the
Mm.
place you've never been to that you'd most like to go to, and why?
First place that comes to mind is Maldives, only because I randomly came across a picture, this was a while ago, of a beach that reflects the stars, and you can see the stars in the water. I think it's so gorgeous, I wanna experience it in person. That's why Maldives.
Yeah, I think doesn't the Maldives have like a lot of like mangrove swamps where like the tree roots are like in the ocean and you can see them and stuff like that. That's what I attribute
Oh,
to the
that's cool.
Maldives, but I may be making that up.
I haven't looked into it, but you may not be making it up. If I go, I'll see if that's the case when I go.
So here's my favorite question to ask people:
Mhm.
why do you do what you do?
That is a really good question. I think ultimately I go back to leaving the world better than what I found it is ultimately knowing that my existence made an impact, even if it's on just one person. And that's like the ultimate goal, no matter what I end up doing for the rest of my life. Great.
So, how do you react now that you know that aliens are real and crash retrieval programs are happening? So,
Okay.
I'll tee this up before you answer.
Yes.
So, the other day I was watching this video on YouTube and it just freaking blew my mind where they're interviewing this guy who apparently had firsthand direct knowledge of he found UFOs and goes and collects them for these secret organizations, and he's like seems super serious and realistic. And so I had happened to talk to Sonali that day, and I'm like, I gotta send somebody this video, and so I send it to you, and you're like, I've
Uh,
watched it 3 times now. It's like 3 hours long too, so it's like
it
not a short watch.
is.
And we haven't actually had a chance to debrief it since you've talked about it. So I wanted to actually hear about it on the podcast. So what
Oh,
is your
Lord.
reaction?
Well, one, when you sent me that video, all I said is the option to stay in denial. Does that exist? Is that on the table? And Cole said, that's not how we live. So, no, you cannot be in denial. You have to accept the reality that aliens do exist. I choose to still stay in denial, but we're still going to talk about it. I found it fascinating. First of all, you did say it's 3 hours long. I found it fascinating that I was able to sit through it many times. So I had to split it up throughout the whole week. But do aliens exist? Yes. Will they take over the world? Maybe. If they do, I feel like we probably won't even know until they want to destroy it, which I hope they don't.
That's a good rapid fire answer. All right. I would move on to the one big question or big hypothetical. All right.
Oh.
So if you were a senior in high school, what would you do after graduation? Would you go to college? If
Mm.
so, what would you study to prepare for an AI future?
Would I go to college? Like, I have to go to college? I thought that was going to be
No,
another
would you go
option.
to college? I said yes or no,
Oh.
right? Because that's a choice now.
Mhm.
And if you decided to go to college, what would you study for to prepare for an AI future?
Is it okay to say that I wouldn't prepare for the AI future? I went
Totally
to
fine.
school. I did not want to go study computer science. So when we think about AI, that's the only thing I can think of. And quite frankly, I don't think that's what I want to go study. I love using it. I love being the end user, but I don't know if I want to go create, build, understand the technical depth of AI. And I think I would probably take a year off just to go travel the world.
Where would you go?
Everywhere. I'd probably take, as they show in these Hollywood movies, that you take a year off and you go take a Europe a trip backpacking for like a month and so on. I'd go explore Asia. I would go to some African countries as well. South America. Yeah, everywhere. Why pick? I'd
Yeah.
be the girl that walks around with so many stamps on her passport.
Well, I guess kind of the question behind the question is if
Mhm.
you could do it over again, would you do it the same or would you choose something different?
If I could do everything over again, I would allow myself to make more mistakes in every single thing I tried. I think that's the only thing I would change is mess up more. Apart from that, I would not change anything. I think it's good where I'm at. And if I didn't make those mistakes or choose that route, I wouldn't be sitting here.
Yeah,
So I'm thankful.
absolutely. All right. Well, let's go into the what I'm reading section.
Ooh.
So, the first thing that I am reading is a post from John Kim, who I guess is the CEO of a tool called Paraform. Don't know what they do, but he made a post about Anthropic, so the company behind Claude, the AI tool. And he said every member or every technical employee at Anthropic shares the same job title, member of technical staff, MTS. And it's not just corporate branding, it's part of their talent strategy. It's a calculated move, and he puts 4 points together why this is calculated. It defends against poaching because it prevents competitors from identifying seniority and targeting specific employees. It reinforces company culture. Anthropic values research over hierarchical decision making, and these titles show it. It keeps their team structure opaque. It's hard to infer an employee's research and specialization from generic titles. And number four, it breaks down the researcher engineer divide. Unified titles encourage more versatile talent who excel at both building and theorizing. So it goes on even further, but I wanted to get your reaction to this, Sonali. Is this an interesting thing? Is this going to be a trend? Why do you think that they're doing it? Is it the reasons they stated? What's going on here?
I had many different thoughts. I think the first thought was not so positive. I'm like, why would you do that? That does not make sense. And I think preventing your employees to be poached or approached by your competitors, I just feel like you have a internal organization problem where you feel like you have to take such drastic steps to do that or prevent that. That's where my mind went. And I don't necessarily know if employees themselves would receive it positively. So I think the organization, if that's the kind of change that they want to make, or maybe they already made it, they would have had to go through a lot of convincing for their employees to be able to
Mhm.
adapt to that change, which again, I don't think we live in a world where people stay committed to one organization for the rest of their life. Maybe some
Mhm.
people do, but I don't think that's how everyone sees their career. So you're kind of preventing your employees from growth opportunities as well if they choose to seek employment elsewhere, I think it would make it more difficult for them to be like, I stayed in XYZ role for 10 years. Now I'm looking to change. Like, okay, you stayed at a company for 10 years and didn't get anything, like didn't grow, didn't prove your ROI, you know? So it makes it more difficult for employees. And I think it's a very selfish approach as an employer.
That is absolutely. I had many different reactions. One of them
Mhm.
was this is a employer friendly, employee unfriendly decision to make, and in a
Yes.
variety of capacities. But one of the great things that people talk about with making non hierarchical organizations is like,
Mhm.
see, there's not so much hierarchy here. Everybody's a person. Everybody's a human. That's the positive side. The
Mhm.
negative side is you can't recognize anyone. You can't promote anyone. You can't
Yeah.
like, or if you can, it has to be like secret,
Yeah.
right? And so that creates a really weird situation. And so a lot of the motivation that goes into like, why does somebody want to strive? Why do they want to
Mhm.
make a name for themselves? Like they want to have a personal brand. Well, you can't have a personal brand because everybody's wearing the same uniform with the same
Mhm.
title. All of you are the same. There's no differences here.
Yeah.
But
And
the
I think
second thing is it's so employer friendly because yeah, they're doing it all because they're worried about their talent getting poached, right? They say it's because they're trying to promote company values and they're trying to like decrease the researcher engineer divide. But do you
Mhm.
really think it was the job titles that was making the engineer researcher divide, or was it the mentalities or the management styles, right?
Mhm.
All of those
Mhm.
different things are competing priorities. Like the titles, I imagine, is a very small part of that. Whereas it's really, they're trying to create a defensible position so people can't come in and poach their talent. Like it really comes back to that. And so I thought this was it's probably a really smart move, honestly. But if you're a small company and everybody else is big and that everybody's trying to come out and give your employees like $1 million offers, make it at least a little bit harder for them to do that. But in the end, it's like, I imagine this has some really weird side effects culturally.
Oh, I definitely think so too. I can imagine being in a company, and as you mentioned, there's no incentive for employees to even work harder or be more productive than what they're already doing because let's say I've been in a role for 10 years and someone just joins and they're at the same level and same title. And I'm not saying title adds credibility, but it does to an extent, you know, as you're introducing someone. If I go up to someone and be like, oh, I'm just starting out into the people analytics field, I'm definitely going to get treated differently than someone who's like, oh, I'm a director in this field. And it's just human nature. I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the next one that I'm reading right now from actually prior guest on the podcast, he had a different name at the time. He's going by Jepson Taylor. His name used to be Ben Taylor. I'm not sure the backstory there. But Jepson is doing a lot of work with his company Viox now on AI in the workplace. And what he put together is he's saying that generative machine learning algorithms, so these are different from Gen AI or Auto ML, are absolutely destroying traditional machine learning algorithms invented by humans in these contests that they have, like Kaggle and things like that. And so it makes the crowd favorites like XGBoost, CatBoost, TabNet, LightGBM look like toys in comparison. And he has a graph on the screen that you guys can't see, but basically, if you look at this competition, I think you have to go down something like 15 or 20 spots before you're talking about a human created algorithm. All of the top 10 or 15 were created by AI, generative machine learning algorithms. And so he poses this question about, the data scientists, do you really need them? And the direction I wanted to go with this before you react is I hear a lot nowadays about people saying, oh, AI, it's a nothing burger. Can it really do anything that humans can't do? Right? Like it can write a good research report, it can, write good code, but is it just an augmenter or is it a replacer? The thing here is like the machine learning algorithms that he described, those are like some of the most innovative things that human beings have ever created in history,
Mhm.
right? And AI is now generating their own and they're better. And these are the things that, unless you stay in touch with the people who are really on the bleeding edge, you think, oh, it's just like, Chat GPT 3. This is really all AI can do. It's not true. And I'll pause there and I want to get your reaction is how did you react to this and what were your thoughts?
One, I think it was more of, I kind of looked at it as a skeptical approach, only because, well, one, I don't know the person who wrote it personally, and I also don't know the technology that well. So, kind of always seeing any new technology or any new claims from a very skeptical perspective. So that's where
Ah, you think he's
that was
talking
my
his book.
initial.
Yeah, no, I love it. Maybe he
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Maybe he's just, it's a pump and dump. He's like, "Hey, look at all the cool stuff I'm doing," and
Perhaps.
it's not really that cool.
Okay, well, I'm gonna talk about just AI in general. I think it's always gonna have its flaws, and again, I'm gonna quote you in one of your podcasts that you did, an episode, saying that you wanna get away from using AI to create double the work. So if AI produces something, you don't wanna have to sit back and try to double check its work. That's how I'm seeing every single time I'm using AI. Do I have to double check its work? And I'm gonna be honest, I don't understand ML that well. So for me to comment like, "Oh, this is a lie," or "This is, a big truth," that I'm gonna believe in, I can't make that claim because I don't have that much knowledge in ML.
No, I love that angle though, because one of the quotes, another one that I subscribe to is like, it's from Charlie Munger, who was one of the people who formed Berkshire Hathaway with Warren Buffett. So
Mm,
if you show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. And so if the incentives are much like I was saying earlier about stock prices in public companies, and anything they communicate publicly is intended to make their stock price go up. If
mhm.
the intention here is for, him to get as much publicity as possible, then say, the most provocative thing out there. So maybe it is an incentives based thing. Maybe this actually isn't true. But under the like, let's just say for the sake of argument, what are the implications that the top things that human beings are doing are now, like, the conversations I hear secondhand and third hand is like, there's either the folks that are like AI is a nothing burger, right?
Mhm.
Or there's people that are like AI, we're on the precipice of AGI, and or ASI is coming next. And people don't realize that. I mean, we've talked about Ethan Mullick a million times on the podcast. I saw him post something earlier this week that it's like, the people that work in AI really believe that this stuff is coming. And
Yeah.
it's like right around the corner. And what society's not prepared. What are we going to do about it? And again, maybe they're all like, pump and dumping it, right? Like I mentioned earlier. But let's say for the sake of argument that it's true, and you're seeing it kind of unfold before your eyes, right? So if the assumption is true that these machine learning algorithms are some of the most sophisticated things humans have ever built, and AIs are now building better versions,
Mhm.
what happens? What happens then? Like at that immediate moment, not 5
Yeah.
years in the future, but what
Yeah.
happens? Is it just like all our data scientists get way better because they have better algorithms, or do they start firing data scientists
Yeah.
because you don't need the data scientists because their best algorithm doesn't work anymore?
My mind went to the second, the lateral part is employers replacing employees with AI to be able to do that work. Not saying that's gonna be a good or a bad thing, but that's exactly what I see happening. Let's say everything works and AI is able to create like really good ML models. Yeah, I think it's gonna first replace the employees. Immediate reaction would be, "Oh shit, I'm about to lose my job." And then the second would be you lose your job because AI ended up did replacing you. So now you're on the market. And then you realize the skills that you knew are no longer relevant. So how do you become more relevant?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know.
absolutely. Well, I think that's a good kind of provocative place to leave that one. I've got one more for you, and this is actually from my current employer, Lightcast, but I did not do this research, so I don't feel like this is too promotional. And it's called "The Next Great Resignation is Coming." And this was actually kind of an interesting thing because we started this podcast right when the Great Resignation was happening, and so this article goes through kind of a lot of what was going on in 2021 through 2023, and why did it happen, and what are the reasons behind it. But they also say they're kind of creating the argument that there's like this pin up energy in the labor market, and maybe perhaps because so many people aren't quitting their jobs over the last 2 or 3 years because they haven't been able to find a new one, that another great resignation is on the horizon. And they identified three industries where this is most likely to happen. And so they said that people who quit their jobs in food service, retail, and hospitality are more likely, when they quit, they're going to start in a totally new industry. And so those industries are most at risk when thinking about this great resignation that might be coming, because if people all of a sudden start to get opportunities, if you're in the food service, retail, and hospitality, those people might be going completely somewhere else once this pin up energy gets put out. But how did you react to this one, and what are your thoughts on the great resignation?
I was gonna say this was one of the most fascinating and exciting articles that I read recently. So I'm glad you reshared it with me too to discuss it today. I'm excited for that to happen. That's one. And then two, I do sense that the two types of resignations will happen, which I guess in the article it also hints is one, people retiring, and then two, the shift towards employees will lead to more resignation, as you mentioned, like people being able to find new jobs. So they will definitely be leaving the jobs that they currently don't want to stay in. And I think there was a lot of other articles that came out just discussing individuals are just not happy with the job that they currently have. So I definitely see that happening. I don't know how soon. Maybe the resignation through retirement will lead to the second wave of the another resignation. And after reading the article, I went down a rabbit hole of just Googling how many people on average retire or hit the age of 65 in America every single year. And
Yeah.
it's going to be 4.1 million every single year. People hit 65.
Well, and the crazy part in this, getting into some of the weeds of the article, and some of the prior research that Licecast has done that we've had like some of the prior guests like Ron Hetrick and Mark Hansen talk about is the rising storm. That number of people retires every year, but they don't get replaced by that same number of people. And so there's actually talent labor shortages on the way right in time for AI wave to be crashing in. So it's a fascinating time coming in the labor market in the next few years.
Yeah. I'm excited to see what comes out of it. I'm curious to know if a lot of those jobs will get replaced by AI first. And then I'm also kind of concerned if there's shortage of employees, would they be overburdened? Might not be the right word, but that's the only one I can think of. Overburdened by the amount of responsibility that they get to carry out because there's not enough people to distribute the work. And would that be effective? I don't know.
Well, it's a good question, and my colleague Ron Hetrick literally wrote a report called "Who's Going to Do the Work," which
Yeah.
answers some of those questions. So, if you want to go check that out, be my guest.
Oh,
That said, Sonali, do you have anything you wanted to talk about with me today?
yes. I know we discussed a couple of those things before, so I had follow-up questions on that. How do you teach the non-technical skills, especially when it comes to critical thinking? Because I feel like that's going to become extremely important, but how do you teach that to someone?
Can I split those into two real quick? So
Yeah.
the non-technical skills and then critical thinking. I actually think about teaching them differently. Critical thinking, the best way to teach critical thinking, well, I've heard from, I'm not an engineer by training, but people who do engineering for whatever reason say that engineering is a really great way of teaching critical thinking, especially something called first principles thinking. So you're deconstructing a problem down to its core elements and rebuilding it up again from first principles. So that's one area, and I've dug a little bit into that on my own. The other is more from kind of the like debate, but there's an actual term for it, and it's always being able to make both sides of an argument. Right. And we've done that a little bit on some of these articles where you say, like, okay, here's the positive story, but what's the negative story?
Yeah.
And there's a famous quote by a philosopher named John Stuart Mill, which is, if you only know your side of the argument, you know little of that. Which means if you can't make the case for both sides of the argument, you probably don't even really understand your side of the argument.
Mm.
And so that really is a great way of teaching critical thinking to people, is to be able to understand a problem from every perspective, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll go in terms of non-technical skills, and I'll reference you from earlier in this conversation where you were saying in the non-technical space, it's not really soft skills. It could be things like active listening, like you mentioned, but it's really about like, how do you get the repetitions to know how to interface with customers? You can't just send out your dashboard and hope that people will use it,
Yeah.
right? And the reality is, it does take repetitions, but a lot of it is, and it's surprising to me because there's so many people that are trained in like the soft sciences or the social sciences that go in and do this work, that this isn't intuitive for them. But it's about perspective taking. It's, I shouldn't be just sharing my perspective with the customer and saying, oh, they just need to know how I think about the world when I put it out there. Why don't they care about how cool my dashboard looks? And it's about
Yeah.
perspective taking. It's like, what is the problem that a customer is facing? What are their motivators? What are their incentives? And when you're working with them, really trying to take their perspective in terms of when you're doing a project or building a dashboard or building, predictive type of work for your organization, what problem are they trying to solve? Not which problem am I trying to solve? What are they trying to solve? Taking their perspective, really understanding that deeply, and then you can make an impact. That is the way I would give people advice, and it is so apparent when people aren't able to do that.
Mm.
So you could ask me, like, I've actually learned a lot of that through this podcast, frankly, and I think you would probably agree with this since you've got your own.
Mhm.
Is a podcast forces you to take the other person's perspective because you're
Definitely.
really learning and digging deeply into another human being. And frankly, I probably wasn't very good at this when we started. I'm probably not very good at it now either, but I've gotten better. And it really forces you, like, what is a guest thinking when I'm going to ask them about aliens, right? It's like, how can I do this in a way that they're not going to get fired from their job? And it forces you to say, what do they care about? What is their perspective? And how does it make a difference? Because a lot of times I think when people are like, oh, you started a podcast, what they really want is a megaphone.
Hmm.
They want to share their own thoughts with the world. They want to share their perspective with the world. And you realize that it's like, no, actually, we're bringing on a bunch of guests and we're going to share that guest perspective with the world. And we're
Mhm.
just here to be the Sherpas of giving the guest, that publicity. And so it's really it's been a fantastic practice, and frankly has probably made me a better human being in some ways. But that's how I would say, to long-winded way of answering your question.
I love that you said that. 2 pointers that I wanna make. The first one, I want to acknowledge that this was during one of our, initial conversations when we first connected. You had told me that if you're going into a meeting and you're presenting something and the other person's questions what you're presenting, or they don't agree and so on and so forth, you said you instead of fighting them on what you're presenting, you're listening and then taking their perspective in, like, why are they looking at it this way? Why are they thinking this way? What do they see that I don't see? Instead of, again, arguing with them on, no, I'm right and you're wrong. And that's a perspective I've taken from you because, again, we had that conversation initially and that really stuck with me. So I'm glad you emphasized it again. And go ahead.
Well, can I build on that for a second?
Yeah.
Because, just to reinforce the point about perspective taking, it's actually kind of difficult to get that in advance of showing your work to people, right? You can ask people, like, what do you care about? What are the problems that you're facing? But a lot of
Mhm.
times they're not thinking very critically about it. It's only when you share something that might contradict their real thoughts that they're going to share their real perspective, and that is great education. So a lot of times, again, the analysts, they think, oh, my precious precious work. I've done such good work. If anybody criticizes this work, it's going to hurt my ego. And when really they're getting a gold mine of what leaders really care about at that moment, and don't care about your work for a second. Take their perspective, really try to learn. I love that. But what's the second point that you were going to make? I know I interrupted you there.
No, it's okay. I'm glad you added that, and I've also used that, again, learning from you, being able to use it and see the impact that it has, so I'm glad you emphasized it. The second point was going to be about doing the podcast. As you mentioned, like, I also host a podcast, and I always saw it as a having a spotlight, but being able to put that spotlight on the person that you're speaking to instead of consistently having it on yourself. So, 1, it makes you a better listener, and then 2, it helps you improve on learning how to ask better questions, learning how to shift the conversation in the direction that you may want or the guest may have shared prior to the recording that they want to go in that direction but lost track during the recording. So, thank you.
Well, you're kind of out to see, like, a good podcast is a conversation, but a good conversation takes work. And I don't think people realize that. Like, having a truly good conversation, like if you're just at dinner with friends,
Mhm.
you actually probably need somebody at that dinner to be guiding the conversation, whether they understand it consciously or unconsciously. Otherwise, it's gonna split off into side conversations, and it's gonna be like, well, where did you go on your vacation, or where did you go on your vacation, instead of something that could truly, where everybody could learn from it. And it really
Mhm.
requires cultivation and curation, much like a museum curator, right?
Mm.
Like, you're
Yeah.
curating a beautiful interaction amongst folks. And so, like, there is some art in that in a podcast. And frankly, I'm not that great at it, but again, I've worked at it over time. But it's not something that happens just on the fly. You have to work at it.
Oh, definitely. I think I learned that once getting into the podcast stuff. I know I enjoy it, but it's before you even get the guest on the show, it is so much work, research and scheduling, logistics, recording. Everything needs to be set out before you can get the guest in front of you and ask them questions and lead the conversation. And then there's post podcast recording work too. So,
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's what I always tell people. And I've told you this, and I'm glad it sounds like you share a similar sentiment. Is like the only
Mhm.
fun part about a podcast is actual recording of the podcast. Everything else sucks, and it's
Yes.
very true. Yeah.
Yes.
So
But it makes up for it, so I think it's fun.
yeah, it does. It's definitely very rewarding. And I
Yeah.
want to, since I have you here, I want to share this with the world. Is like we've been talking for years, and one of the things that I tell you like almost every time we talk is like, why are you asking me for advice? You're more well known than I am. And so like what if you don't already know of Sonali, because thousands and thousands of people do, you're an extremely well-known person in the data world, and but getting to be that point in the people analytics space as well. And so go out there, learn from her. She is a diamond.
I
And I
appreciate
am so glad that you were able to join today. I've been a fan of yours for years. Thank you so much for being here, Sonali. And you actually didn't even say the name of your podcast earlier. Please say what it is and where people can find you.
Yes. Thank you, first of all, Cole, for those really lovely words. I feel like you do this every time we sit in a conversation. So thank you so much. The name of the podcast is called Success Beyond Our Greatest Fears. And I can go into explanation, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn and I can explain why that's the name. And you can find it on YouTube. It's Sonali Kumar. You'll be able to find it. And the link is also on my LinkedIn. So hopefully you can find it. And one of the things I actually do want to add is a thank you to Cole. I have been a biggest fan, and I think I started following you before I even knew you. And I like to say stalked, but mostly like just looking through your LinkedIn profile. Like, what do you do? All the value that you've added. And I think you were probably the first, I think the second person that I met in the people analytics space. And I'm so grateful that you became part of my journey. And one of the points that I wanted to add is going back to the mentorship thing. I am so glad that I have you in my corner because even when I didn't believe in myself, you did. So thank you.
Oh, that's very sweet. Well, you've been listening to Direction Correct, to People on the podcast with Cole and Scott, and today's guest, Sonali Kumar. Sonali, you're wonderful. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.